Having looked at the building as an overall composition from a distance, today we're going to focus on a detail. Looking at materials and details up close adds another layer of information to our understanding of the building. The chapel, which is a very elegant building, also has beautiful detail. And although it looks like a very simple building from far away, up close we find that there's a lot of detailing in the column capital, for instance. An individual column capital in itself can also be a really interesting, challenging, and beautiful thing to draw, and in some ways simpler than drawing the overall composition, which can be pretty complicated sometimes. We'll go through the same steps that we did for the entire building, which is to take a moment to look at the basic geometric shapes that constitute that form and then draw them individually one at a time, making sure that the relationship that they have with each other in real life is retained in our drawing. The first thing I'm going to start with is the square part of the capital. So I'm blocking out the very top rectangle, which is actually a square, but it seems like a rectangle from our vantage point. Lines that are parallel in real life should be parallel in the sketch too. So in that case, this line, and this line need to be parallel to each other, and these three need to do the same. And once we have that relationship, then we can move on to the next step. The column itself, the circular capital and the square capital are all centered on each other, and that's a relationship that we need to maintain. The way to do that is to draw the diagonals of the rectangle we just drew, and where they intersect is the center point of that composition. And then from there we draw a vertical line, and that's going to serve as the center point of our entire composition. The next step would be to draw the circle, which sits right under the square we just drew. And this part is the most challenging part for this, because drawing circles is hard in itself, but drawing circles in perspective when they become ellipses is very difficult, and this is going to take a few tries. The way to do it is to draw several ellipses in very light pencil until we get the shape we want, and then to darken the one that we like. And sometimes, actually very often, it's made up of different sections of the many, many ellipses that we drew. And so we're going to do that here. We won't really see the rear side of the circle, so we don't really need to draw that. And then what we'll do is draw another circle parallel to the one we just drew, or ellipse I should say, also centered on this line that we also just drew as a center line. And then we can very lightly draw the core of the column. The column is flared, which means that the diameter at the base is slightly larger than the diameter at the top. So although I drew these lines, the lines of the column straight to start with, what I need to do is change them a little bit so that the flare becomes apparent. So I'm going to widen the lines as they go towards the bottom of the page. So what I'll do is draw another outline for the column, making sure that I give a slight flare to the lines on the side as they go towards the bottom. And then what we will do, having blocked all that out, is come back and add a little bit of the decoration at the top, which is just a few lines, 3 of them. What I will do, because this looks pretty good, is darken them. So I'm going to have first drew the top of the column itself, and then come back and just use a simple thick line for the details, and then come back and finish that out. What I'm going to do next is draw the fluting. So the column isn't perfectly round. Well, it's round, but the surface isn't perfectly smooth. There are scalloped edges, and I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 that I can see. And so I'm going to take that number and divide it by 2, which gives me about 4.5, and divide each section of each half of my column and do something like this. As the flutes go toward the edge, they get narrower and closer together. Start to hardline this, and I'll start with the fluting. And what it does is those individual flutes, each one is larger than the one below, so they all wrap around and we see a little bit of the edge as it goes towards the back of the column. And then here we can do something like this. We can then show this detail. This is the part where it engages with the main building. And then I'm going to draw this line continued on the other side. And then this we'll take out and just do this. And then this is showing the underside. One of the reasons I really like this detail, especially when the light is good, is because it creates really beautiful shadows. Again, those are visually important. They make the drawing richer, but again, they're also important because they add more information. So because the shadow on this fluting is scalloped, we know that those are curved surfaces on top of the column. One important distinction to make when we are sketching architecture is the difference between shadows and shade. Shadows are nice and dark. The darker you make them, the better they look. And shade is simply areas without light. The shadow always looks good if you give it a very sharp and dark outline. And then we can come back and fill it in. The shadow at the top blends into a shadow along the edge here. You can use a darker pencil if you have one, or you can just press hard on this pencil, on the pencil you're using, and it'll give you the darkness and the texture that you need. What I will do is color the entire underside of the capital, but lightly, making sure it's not as dark as the shadow. There's one more detail that we need to add. It's essentially a groove that's cut into the column. It would be helpful to draw a very light circle here before we do that. As we look up there, we see some dentils, and I'll go ahead and show a few of them. And so what we'll do is show the underside of the dentils, very approximately. As we wrap up this sketch, I'd like to revisit some of the basic concepts that we need to keep in mind. The first one is to analyze the object and determine the basic geometric shapes that are components of it. The second is to make sure that the relationship of those different shapes is true to what we are seeing. So in this case, making sure that we define the center line and then use that as the organizing element for our sketch. The important thing to remember is that the process of sketching is supposed to be fun and enjoyable, and if there are minor things that don't work out, it isn't a big deal. In fact, some of those variations add a lot of life and movement to the sketch and make them more personal and unique.